In this crunch, right, in this like critical decision-making juncture, guess what the Federal Reserve people used as their tools? Microsoft Word, Microsoft Excel, like Google, and a volume of PDF printouts of economic reports that you would not believe, right? Like literally paper printouts of PDF reports. And he was like, so I use Excel, in his words, I used Excel when I was a student. And the most critical decision makers in running the America's financial system are also using Excel. Like that is mind blowing, right? Like why don't we have better tools to do these kind of things? So that's part of it, right? This is the understand the business problem. And then the other co-founder, Kencho, was a Google engineer, right? And this is something I did not appreciate, but Google, when it comes to data, Google is like Mount Olympus of data. Right? Let me give you an example. So everyone knows Cloudera, right? Hadoop, right? I don't know if you do. Now, everyone knows big data, right? Everyone knows big data. So the sort of technology people are using to deal with big data is something called Hadoop. And we're going to ignore Spark for now. Hadoop, right? Hadoop is an open source implementation off of a research paper published by Google like 5 years after Google built their own in-house technology. And from what a lot of people I've talked to, Hadoop is actually like a crappier implementation than Google's big data, right? So an entire big data enterprise economy was built off of one single paper from Google, right? And think about all the other tools that Google has not actually written research papers about. So that's the context. The other co-founder, Kencho, was someone who came from using all the tools that Google had. And between the two of us, we worked up a solution to financial analyst queries that is pretty good, right? Like it sort of makes intuitive sense. And they just built something that is, you think about it as Wolfram Alpha, but stock analysis, right? So you can ask it questions like, what happens to the price of gold every time the Federal Reserve says the word tapering, right? And it would scan through all of the news events of the Federal Reserve has said, and it scans through all of the events of the price of gold and then do a correlation between the two and say, over the last 18 months, here's all the occurrences, and we found that, in over average terms, like the gold price, shot up 10% every time the Federal Reserve said tapering. And the funny thing about this is, it's not a really hard problem. Like, it's not mind-blowing, right? But for a human being to have solved that problem, we usually have taken 2 to 3 guys, maybe like 4 weeks of like scanning through PDFs, right? Trying to find like what is the date of this thing, what happened then, and trying to do this cross correlation. So then using Excel at the end to stitch it together. So what is similar about these two companies? One, I fundamentally believe that they're going to succeed. But 2, they're building a differentiated technology product that is only able to be built because the non-technical guy went out and experienced pain, right? He like literally went into a world where like things were inefficient and messy and complex, and he sat there and he was like, this really sucks, right? And only after having that realization did he have the confidence to come out and build these things. So my bet, and something we can see play out, is that these guys are not going to pivot anytime soon, right? From an information perspective, pivoting is really about saying, I don't understand what problem I'm going to solve, so I'm just going to go in this direction. And then I'm going to talk to customers. And then no one says anything about my product, so I guess, okay, I'm going to switch to direction B or direction C, right? And that's really expensive. Why not just like start with a concrete realization of a problem and then build a solution for it? So this is the first part of my talk, right? And I think the sort of key lessons I want to leave you with are, 1, be really critical of the information you consume and how it shapes you, right? As a young person, 2, don't really rush into entrepreneurship unless you know that you have an unfair advantage. Right? And I would define unfair advantage for the non-technical guys as either a deep understanding of a particular problem in industry or a lot of political capital. So with that as a context, let me tell you about the most successful startup that America has ever seen. This startup is responsible for creating Silicon Valley. This startup is responsible for creating computers. And this startup is responsible for essentially running the biggest monopoly that America has seen for the last 100 years. Anyone tell me the name of this startup? AT&T. So, let's begin from the beginning. In 1876, right, there was a monopoly that reigned all over America. This monopoly's name was Western Union. Western Union was a telegraph monopoly essentially controlled long-distance communication across the United States. Washington Union also had a sister called Associated Press. Associated Press was the news publication at the time, and because they were buddies with Washington Union, they were the only voice that reached across the entire country and shared what was news. So here's a little short story about Washington Union's power. Right? In 1876, Washington Union decided that they wanted a third-rate, non-entity politician from Ohio to be president of the United States. This guy's name was Rutherford B. Hayes. Rutherford B. Hayes was less qualified than any other people running for president at the time. It was also less known. But he was really good friends with one of the key political operators of the guy who ran Associated Press. So, over the span of several months, Associated Press and Western Union disseminated complete coverage of just like stories lauding the qualities of Rutherford B. Hayes. And they literally took him from nobody and put him into the national pedestal. Simultaneously, they also suppressed any sort of scandals or like negative information about Rutherford B. Hayes and made sure that he was only seen in a positive light. Funnily enough, that was actually not enough to get Rutherford B. Hayes president, right? So the other guy running against Hayes at the time was this gentleman called Sam Tilden. And Sam Tilden was from the Democratic Party and Hayes was from the Republican Party. And at the time of the popular vote, right, this is the sort of like, between the Democratic and Republican Party votes, Hayes was actually lagging Tilden by 250,000 votes, right? And America was smaller at that time, so actually it was a pretty big number. So, what did Western Union do? They read the messages, the telegraph messages being sent over the wire, over their network, right, about the internal party-to-party communication of the Democratic Party, right? And they found a message that said, we're not really sure if we won in the southern states or not. And the Washington Union said, bam! Our party members in the southern states claim immediate victory over your states, and we're going to proclaim Hayes president. And they did. And the Democrats fought it for a few months, but eventually they capitulated, and Hayes was president. So, like, literally, Washington Union and Associated Press cheated and made a guy president of the United States. At that time, there was no understanding of common carriage, which is like, if you own a telecom network, you have to carry everyone's messages. And no concept of net neutrality, meaning that you couldn't bias yourself over one or the other of, like, essentially your vested interests. So that's a really, really long story, but the point is that Washington Union was like life, right? He was like, this is Washington Union right here, this giant sumo wrestler. And the startup in question, Bell Labs, was two guys. One of them worked full-time to teach music to the deaf. His name was Alexander Bell. And in his part-time, he was an amateur inventor. And so he invented, things like the telephone, or tried to. And he had an investor, friend, and patent attorney called Gardner Hubbard. And Hubbard's role in this story is super, super essential. This is something like all of us who want to build giant companies have to understand, right? Alexander Bell, the guy who invented, one of the inventors of the telephone, was not by any means remarkable for inventing a good telephone. In fact, a few years later, someone else invented a better telephone than him. Nor was he the first person to invent the telephone. When he was in the office filing for the patent, there was another guy called Elisha Gray who was also filing for the patent on the telephone. But he had a good friend in Hubbard who was a patent attorney and who had also extreme vendetta and hatred against Western Union, probably for the excesses that we just talked about. So, in the very beginning, Bell got the patent for the telephone, despite not being the first one, and also Hubbard had the insight or just the anger to invest in him and making his company succeed. So they launched the telephone. Washington Union didn't care too much about it. A year later, Washington was like, wow, the telephone was actually going to be pretty bad for business and telegraphs. So what did Washington Union do? Right, this is the fear that everyone here today has when Google does something. Right, Washington Union went and said, you know what, we're going to build a better telephone. So they hired this smart inventor, young smart inventor, called Thomas Edison, and said, can you build us a better version of telephone? Thomas Edison said, sure. And he actually built, like, the common telephone that we use today, this one actually, that's actually Edison telephone. Right? Edison built a better version of telephone, and then Washington Union went out and started selling it, and this is what happened to Bell. Now, the story could end very differently. Bell Labs could never have existed. We might not even be here today. Fortunately, Hubbard did two clever things, right, in his strategic fight against Western Union. The first thing was he hired this gentleman called Theodore Vail. And we're going to get back to Vail in a second, but at the time of hiring, Theodore Vail was running a 3,500 person operation at the post office, right? 3,500 people back in like the 1860s. Well, that was like a small army, right? But he was also pretty bored. He wasn't executing on his full potential. And so when Hubbard showed him the prototype for the telephone, Vail says, "This is the opportunity of a lifetime. I'm gonna quit my job and do this startup." And his boss was like, "Are you crazy? Like you have a cushy job here at the post office, right? You're on the ranks to be promoted to the highest top. Like, why would you leave?" And he said, "Telephone's too powerful." That's number one, what Hubbard did. Number two is Hubbard filed a patent infringement lawsuit. And in an incredible stroke of luck, as the lawsuit on Western Union was being proceeded, the industrialist Stephen Jay Gould, right? He's he's one of the robber barons, also decided that he wanted to do a hostile takeover of Western Union. So suddenly, Western Union, the giant supervisor, had two large targets on his back. One had to fight off this competing interest of gold, and also had to fight this potentially costly and potentially damaging lawsuit, patent infringement. So he decided to negotiate the deal, and I bet whoever negotiated the deal thought that they were pretty clever about it, but it turned out to be one of the worst business mistakes in the history of everything. Right? Here's the deal. It said, one, you have to pay us 20% revenue share on every Edison phone that you sell. Two, you stay out of the telegraph market. And three, we will stay out of the telephone market. And Bell said, "Hell yeah, let's take it." So they took it. And of course, the next few years, the Bell and Company grew up to be this very profitable, very successful company. Right? Its clients were mostly the rich, private, clientele in northern New England who afforded a private telephone. And Bell was very happy, and Theodore Vail was bored out of his mind. Bell was so happy, and he was not a very ambitious guy, he just wanted to build things, right? So Bell was so happy that every time he had a large profit from his business, he just paid it off in dividends to his shareholders. And he paid off one such fat dividend that Theodore Vail actually was frustrated and actually quit the company and went to South America and said, "I'm going to seek adventures in South America instead." But here's a second part of the story. A few years later, people discovered that telephone technology was actually really that hard. In fact, telephone technology was actually really cheap. And instead of paying Bell lots and lots of money and trying to get on their high clientele list, a lot of farmers decided that they would actually start their own telephone cooperatives. Instead of telephone cables or these fancy giant wooden pins, they'd actually just bring barbed wire around the farm fences and create collectives of telephone co-ops. Right? And these co-ops were actually the beginning of essentially speed of electricity, social networks, right? Because they were all fenced together on the farm posts, right? They actually were not private lines. It wasn't one-to-one. It was actually many-to-many. So people used to play violin music or talk about skits. It literally became a small forerunner for radio later on. And so Bell, in its assurance monopoly, suddenly faced a lot of other competition. And to the independent's credit, they actually did much better than Bell, right? Because think about the number of people who are rich and private at the time, and think about the number of farmers America had who wanted just to be able to talk to their friends. So Bell, once again, was in trouble. And this is where the story gets absolutely ridiculous. Theodore Vail, he's still out in South America. He gets a letter one day from this mysterious gentleman inviting him to come back to America for tea and talks. And this gentleman was J.P. Morgan. So I don't know if you guys know history very well. J.P. Morgan at the time is the human embodiment of finance in the United States. He had more power than the government in terms of moving money around. And so J.P. Morgan saw the state of the universe, saw that Bell was sort of stagnating its market reach, and also saw Vail's potential and said, "Vail, if you come back, you're 63 right now. If you come back, I will buy a controlling share in Bell, I will give the company to you, and you just only have to run it until it is the biggest company in the world." And Bell said, Vail said, "Let's do it." So Vail comes back, right? He is given control of Bell and Company he has a series of really clever business negotiations with all the independents, eventually swallowing up each of them until they became part of the system. He also bought a controlling share in Western Union, which is by this time like a decaying husk of a company, and now had complete telecom communication control over the United States. And it is in the shadow of that monopoly, which lasted for the next 70 to like 100 years, right? Bell Labs was born. They had so much capital and so entrenched in monopoly that they didn't have any competitors. In fact, they were government sanctioned to be a monopoly in the telephone space. And the story of how that happened is a different story. Ask me after. But the moral of the story is, and there's a book that we were all handed earlier today. I don't have a copy of it. Does anyone have a copy of the 3rd chapter of, there we go, 0 to 1, right? So I don't know if you guys had a chance to read this yet. This chapter deals with monopoly, right? Mr. Thiel's argument essentially is monopoly is not that bad, right? Monopoly is actually pretty good if you want to invest in long-term R&D research, because that is the only context in which long-term R&D research makes sense. When you know that your future is secure for the next 2, 3, 4 decades. So this is just the tip of the iceberg, right? Like if you like this type of thinking, right? There's actually the same story or like different versions of that story being played out in all the other media messages that we take for granted today, right? In cinema, in radio, in television, right? And now the internet. So for me, right, the biggest news that recently came up was not Facebook. It's actually AT&T and DirecTV's $49 billion merger. Right, to place this into context, AT&T was broken up as a monopoly in 1980-ish, 90-ish. Right, I don't know exactly. But what people don't know is that over the next 10 years, AT&T actually rebuilt its monopoly. And this is like, there's a fascinating history here that I can't talk about for the sake of time. But the point is that the AT&T that we know today is actually not too different from the AT&T that controlled all of America over the last 70 years. And now they're proposing to merge, essentially buy DirecTV. Right, which is a TV cable company, or broadcast company. So this is like one of the biggest implications of all time, right? This coupled with Netflix's deal to Comcast for the slow dissolvement of net neutrality, like this is literally the tectonic plates shifting beneath our feet today, right? Like all this happened in the last year, right? And for us, people who live in Silicon Valley, we are kind of not really good at seeing that. We see the water around us. The water is largely painted by I would call them the associated, I don't know what's a good term for it, but essentially the guild, that's not a good term. All right, the collection of venture capitalists, Y Combinator, and associated startups, right, who are sort of like farming large crowds of young entrepreneurs everywhere, who are being tricked essentially into thinking that this time is different. This time we're going to make something of our lives because this time we have something other people don't. It turns out it's not necessarily that true. So the last part of the talk, I'm talking about empire, right? What is the practical takeaway we have once we see all of this, right? Once we first understand that what we see and hear as information impacts us fundamentally, it changes our fate, right? And two, that there is a large political and industrial struggle underway right now for the future of the communication networks. So I'd argue that all of this essentially is seeing the water, right? And once you see the water, what you should be doing next is you should try to build your own fish tank, right? Instead of being influenced by the water around you, instead of being influenced by the media and the information that you cannot control, you should be really, really careful about building your own ecosystem of information, of thought, of political influence, and of general long-term thinking. So, does anyone know what this is? This is the new compound that Jeff Bezos is building in Seattle as the headquarters for Amazon. It also looks like giant fish tanks. But he is pouring a lot of money to build a new corporate campus. And the interesting part about Amazon is that Bezos has a close acquaintance who also runs a large-scale retail company that is even more ambitiously trying to create their own intellectual and informational ecosystem. Does anyone know the name of this one? So this is Tony Hsieh's downtown project.